My name is Carolyn Johnson. I'm the Community Development Director here for the county. Thank you so much for coming. You got your postcards or you saw press releases. This is super. We've got a lot of people here today. Wow. Good deal. The reason we're here is to review some floodplain mapping that FEMA has updated. And I'm going to go into a few other remarks and then hand off to them. But before I do, I'd like to introduce just a few other county folks that are here and other agency folks, if I could. And this is in no particular order. Donna from the City of Brookings, the planning manager there. She's around here somewhere. Jody Fritz, she's the city administrator in Gold Beach. They're in the back. Riley Smith, hold your hand up, Riley. He's our county surveyor. Trudy, where are you? I don't see her. She's on our real property task force. There she is. Yes, the board has used her help quite a bit in years past. Don Kendall, our emergency services manager. Please hold your hand up. And let's see. I know I'm missing somebody, but three people who you probably know very well are your three commissioners. Commissioners Gold, Commissioners Boyce, Commissioners Huxley. I don't know if Commissioner Huxley is back yet, but they're all here as well. You know, one other person who's here is Carl King. He's on our Citizens Advisory Committee. He really helps get the word out when things like this are happening. And anyway, but before I go on, I'd like all the people that are here from FEMA and DLCD to please hold up your hands, please. These are really some hardworking state and federal type employees, and they don't very often get a big kudo, but I want to really thank them for their work. Without them, none of this would happen. I certainly wouldn't be doing it. I don't have that kind of technical expertise, so I want to thank you. Anyway, FEMA has developed some preliminary maps that are going to be used to remap Curry County because the maps that we have now no longer accurately reflect the risk of a 1% flood. And in this presentation, you're going to hear more about what these maps are going to mean for each of you. There's also going to be time for you to each have one-on-one meetings with folks, experts from FEMA, DLCD, other folks that are here that I just mentioned if you wanted to speak with us. And they're also going to talk to you about a few steps you can take to prevent losses on your property due to flood hazards. So we are going to get started. Down the road, we're going to be looking at some other hazards, but right now we're focusing on flood hazards. So I'd like to turn this over to David Ratty for a presentation. And I think you have your mic. And any of your, okay, any of the staff that might be speaking, please come get a mic as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for those opening remarks. I appreciate the county and the city's involvement with this study. As Caroline mentioned, my name is David Ratty. I'm an engineer with FEMA Region 10. I oversee our flood study production work in the state of Oregon. And my primary role with FEMA, though, as is often explained to me, I'm an emergency manager. That's our primary purpose. We're emergency managers to help communities protect life and property. That's the number one mission of FEMA. And sometimes I ponder, why am I in this role? And I look back kind of maybe to my childhood, and one of my initial interests was to be a weatherman. And that didn't turn out. I'm generally not comfortable in front of a TV, things like that. But I would dress up and pretend to be a weatherman. But I had this natural interest in weather phenomena. And then I also remember an incident where growing up on the East Coast, in the state of Maryland, camping with my family on the coast, maybe Ocean City, Maryland, and a hurricane was brewing. So there were warnings that came out. And I remember my parents scrambling to pack up the tent, pack up the camping gear, and find a hotel room. And now, so many years later, as a parent, I think, wow, that must have been very stressful for them. And as a kid, it's kind of fun just to watch the storm from safety, the safety perspective of a hotel room, seeing the winds blow power lines and things like that. But I think as a parent, one needs to be prepared. And so that's one reason I have this interest to be drawn into our FEMA programs. So in addition, I also have an interest in engineering and trying to understand how Mother Nature works. So with engineering, we use complex models and formulas to mimic what Mother Nature would do in a riverine setting or a coastal environment. So I'll have an opportunity to share some of that consideration today as well. But as FEMA, well, one question you might have is why are we studying Curry County now? And Curry County was selected along with all the coastal counties within the state of Oregon, Washington, and some populated areas of Alaska because FEMA committed to Congress to update flood hazard information along all populated coastal areas. So as we bring the best science that we could put together over the last 7 years, working with the county and the cities and our partners, and now is up to the county and the city to determine what to do with that data. Do they, what mitigation strategies, what consideration for preparedness. And then each one of you might have a story of your own of why you're here. And that's why we're here, so that we can answer questions you might have in understanding how this affects your livelihood or your planning for development of a property or your general interest in your community. So this is going to be a little bit awkward. I have slides up front, but I'm told I should stand in this area. I might sneak up there from time to time. We're going to do a short presentation talking about the overview of the study and then also describe what we have set up for today. So I don't have time to introduce all of the project team members, but some key ones are the state agencies, DGAMI, DLCD. We have a lot of contract support, and also Oregon Office of Emergency Management will be supporting other aspects of this project. So this project was funded under a program called RISC-MAP. And MAP is an acronym representing mapping, assessments, and planning. So I'm responsible for the mapping side of things. That's the flood insurance study update. But we also want to integrate that with assessments, which is using different data analytics to better understand what flood hazards, what it means to the community. How does it affect infrastructure or economics, the other driving factors. And then that's incorporated with planning in terms of looking at, okay, what do we do about it? What can we do to offset some of these risks, risks from natural hazards? And then FEMA has a number of other programs, some of those mentioned here, including hazard mitigation planning and building sciences, as well as the National Flood Insurance Program. So focusing on flood, this is data from national riverine disasters. So it ignores or discounts damages resulting from coastal surge events. But we see a trend of increasing damages over time. So on the bottom, we have a timeline of over 100 years, and on the y-axis, damages in billions of dollars. So one purpose of the National Flood Insurance Program is to try and offset that trend. And then just looking at the state of Oregon, and all this data is from NOAA, adjusted for inflation. Of course, we see two big events, riverine events, the 1964 and then the 1996. And one interesting aspect of what I would question, given that the 64 event is typically considered to be the more damage-causing event, that in terms of the infrastructure we have today, what type of numbers of damages would we see? So the National Flood Insurance Program is broken up into 3 disciplines. Mapping, once again, which is the development of the flood studies, regulations, and insurance. And I'll talk about each of those a little bit more. So with the mapping, we produce flood insurance rate maps and assign risk ratings, which are then used for insurance ratings. Insurance is made available through the National Flood Insurance Program for participating communities. In addition, the program sets minimum floodplain construction standards which reflect those regulation side, the regulatory side of things. But once again, the key driver of this program fits back into the main objective of the risk map program, and that's driving at whole community resilience. So, quick summary of what brought us here today. I mentioned this project's been in the works for over 7 years. So we started with scoping in 2009, that September, and then we had some follow-up scoping and discovery where we collected additional data and looked at not just flooding but other hazards. Production for the flood study continued until 2014 when we shared draft work maps with the county and the cities. So that was one key milestone to allow for collaboration where FEMA could answer questions, take comments from the county and the cities, and incorporate any additional information into the study update. Then we did have a little bit of a gap after that period because we had to fund some additional work within the study. So we were able to then finally release preliminary flood insurance rate maps and the flood insurance study last summer, August of last year. We then had another coordination meeting with the county and the cities to start planning for this meeting and talked about the next steps, and that occurred in September of last year. So there are two key products that come out of a flood insurance study update. On the left, we have a flood insurance study report. We have a copy of that report on a table back here that you can browse through. It's also available online and with your county or city. That report is accompanied by the flood insurance rate maps, which tend to get the greater of the interest, because as I mentioned, those maps are then used for the development standards as well as the insurance ratings. So Ted is going to help cover in more depth the scope of work. We have a scoping map also available at a table, and he will also talk a little bit about the coastal study update.
Thank you, Dave.
There we go. Ooh, a little close.
All right, I'm Jed Roberts with the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. I manage our geologic survey program, and I've been involved in this project since the beginning. Our department is a cooperating technical partner with FEMA. You can see it's been a big effort to this point. You saw all the different agencies that are involved. Our role is to do the science and the mapping. So Dave mentioned emergency managers at FEMA. We're not that. We are scientists. We are geologists or geographers. And so we were brought in primarily to work on the open coast sections and determining new base flood elevations and doing the mapping. And so you see a map up here right now, and there are just a bunch of lines on there with a bunch of different colors. But that stuff means something, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But right now, this just kind of shows the north part of the county, and then the central part, and the south part. And I've got a hard copy version of this. But this is essentially the scope map that we laid out in 2009 that tells us what the level of effort we're going to put into the different areas for the floodplain mapping. Because you're constrained by money, right? If you have unlimited money, you can get as much detail as possible into determining the base flood elevation. But you don't want to spend that kind of effort in areas where people don't live, and where we determined that the base flood elevations are actually pretty good already. So that process was done back in 2009, and we worked with the local officials at the time to basically finalize that plan, and from there we went forward. So this is the outcome of that and kind of our roadmap. So there are 5 different approaches that I'll talk about here. And a lot of words on the slide here. This is going to be available to folks, so I'm not going to read through all of it. But the first approach that we took here, which actually we spent most of our time and most of our money, was to do field survey-based detailed studies of the open coast. And we focused these areas along the coast for Port Orford, Nasika Beach, Gold Beach, and Brookings, where the people live, right? And I'll talk about some of the details that went into determining those new areas. The other technology that was really important to this and data that was available to us is called LiDAR. And it's a big part of why we've been doing the mapping that we've been doing up and down the coast, because this data is just much more detailed than was available at the time that the original studies that your current maps are based off from that were done in the 70s and 80s. And so a couple different versions of how we were applying LiDAR was either out on the coast along those unpopulated areas of the coastline, where we're basically just doing a geomorphic determination of where flooding is likely, and then all along river studies as well. So you'll see these on the flood insurance rate maps as Zone A or Zone B. Those are your approximate areas that don't have typically high areas of population. The first one up there is what you'll see on the maps as Zone VE, as is mentioned there. So number 4 here is detailed studies that we essentially inherited from the 1970s or 80s era maps. And that's where we just use LiDAR to remap those base flood elevations. So essentially they were using old topo sheets to do the mapping back in the 70s and 80s. We use the LiDAR to put the lines where they're supposed to be. And then finally a similar approach is used for, really it's just Garrison Lake is the only one where there's an approximate Zone A area. We use LiDAR to tidy that up as well. And there actually are a few areas out in the far east of the county where we did not have LiDAR available. Because we didn't have it, we simply had to incorporate the mapping as is. That's basically the Rogue River and its tributaries once you get about 10 miles upstream here. So this is a digital version of the type of elevation information that was available at the time the 70s and 80s era maps were made. And so this shows Brookings, and you can see it's kind of blobby. You can see that, all right, maybe the lower elevations are the lighter blue and the higher elevations are red, but you don't get a lot of detail there. So this next image here shows the detail that LiDAR brings. And you can really start to see a lot of the stacks in the ocean really come clear. You can see road beds. You can actually see where building pads are. Now there are different versions of this type of data that you can look at. What we use is called the bare earth model, which is the LiDAR model where buildings and trees and cars and birds and all the different things that the sensor picks up are stripped away, so we can just be concerned with the lay of the land. And just a little bit more on the technology itself. It's a sensor that is flown on like a Cessna airplane, pretty low elevation, about 3,000 feet. It's an eye-safe laser, so if you were to look at it, and you could see it at night, but it's typically flown during the day, that calculates the reflection of that laser to a very precise elevation. So for instance, if you were to go out in the parking lot here and take a surveyed elevation point with like survey gear, really high grade stuff, you would find that the LiDAR sensor would actually be within a couple inches of what a surveyor would find. So extremely precise. The main limitation of LiDAR is that it doesn't penetrate water. Well, two limitations. It doesn't penetrate water, and where there's a lot of vegetation, it can be a little bit tricky to get a good ground model because you've got really thick Doug fir or you've got really thick blackberry or gorse. Those are going to be situations where your ground model might not be perfect. But for the investment that you put into LiDAR to get a regional coverage of data at that density, it's really pretty incredible. So just want to quick mention the part that our agency really focused on was the coastal flood zone mapping, and just want to talk briefly about what was done in the detailed areas and the approximate. So the zone VE on the maps and the zone V. So for zone VE, our staff surveyed 110 transects along those areas that I mentioned, right? So Port Orford, Gold Beach, Brookings. And these were surveyed very detailed with survey gear, and they were the basis for us coming up with base flood elevations, and I'll show a graphic of how that was used. And I mentioned the approximate coastal. These are the areas where it wasn't worth us spending that time and effort because there isn't development along the coast in those areas. So what we did there is simply use this kind of information and make a judgment as geologists as to what a reasonable area of flooding would be. So Dave talked a bit to why we did this, the national effort from FEMA to Congress to map these coastal areas. Some other advantages, since so much time has passed, we've actually got a lot of new observational data for tide gauges as well as wave buoys that NOAA manages about 100 miles or so off the coast here. That's the kind of information that we feed into our models to come up with a base flood elevation. There's obviously been a lot of change in development and land use over the last 30-35 years. We've seen some construction and removal of shore protection structures. Those are important when you're figuring a base flood elevation and how to map the flood zone. There's constant change to bathymetry in the near shore, especially. So bathymetry being basically the analogous, the analog to topography on land, right? It's the shape of the ocean floor, and then the topographic data that I talked about. Just a couple images here of some of the kind of information that we're trying to capture here in these maps. So this is some flooding of Garrison Lake on the bottom left there. During a storm, I think that was in '99. And then up in the top right there, that's not here in the county, that's up in Neskowin and Tillamook, but an area that's really seen a lot of bad coastal flooding that we'd like to highlight. And then just on the bottom right there, there's an area north of Hunter Creek where you can see the rack line, basically where the debris is getting up, and you can see that there's flooding on a regular basis up to that riprap. So this is a very basic kind of primer on how we do the coastal modeling. And I can give you more detail, and I'll talk about where you can really get the nitty-gritty on this stuff on our website. But basically, you're trying to capture three things here. The first is the regional variation. So that's the big waves on the offshore that are captured by those buoys, right? Those are the ones that are measuring wave direction and wave period, basically how big the waves are. We look at that information during the big storms that have happened in the past to help feed what wave heights and direction we should be looking at. Next is to model that into the near shore. So we don't have buoys that can measure that information directly because it's such a rough environment that the buoys would basically be ripped up for their moors. That's why they are out off the shelf like they are. So that requires some modeling that we work with Oregon State University. Some researchers there have helped us out with that modeling effort. That turns into base flood elevations that we map onto the LiDAR, which is the next step there. And so you can see on the top left here, there's a lot of math that goes into this, right? But what we've done is measured the transects, and you can see one of my colleagues there on the bottom left walking one of those transects. That feeds into the equation above that about what the total water elevation is going to be. And on the right there, you can see all those lines along Brookings. That's an example of how often spaced those transects are that he's walking there. Similar spacing in Gold Beach and Port Orford. And then final slide for me here. We produced this report here that has all the details about the work that was done for the coastal mapping. And you can get that on our website there. If you just go to oregongeology.org/pubs and you just search Curry County, it's one of the first things that'll pop up, and you can download that as a PDF. And I just wanted to plug a couple other things that our agency has been doing in the county. We, in 2014, we released maps of landslide hazard along the coastal fringe. That's also available on our website. And tsunami inundation and evacuation maps, which many of you may know about, but we released those in 2012 for the county. And there are different scenarios that you can look at there for a Cascadia subduction zone and the likely inundation from that. So that's all I have, and I'll be over at that table after the presentation for any questions. Thanks.
That's good. So to wrap up the scope of work and the model that went into this effort, we also did some riverine analysis. This is for Zone A reaches, approximate reaches, which generally reflect areas with lower populations. So that's why it's considered an approximate analysis. Its counterpart would be a detailed analysis. I'm going to compare and contrast the two a little bit over the next few slides. So kind of breaking down riverine modeling into 3 simple steps. The first step is looking at cross sections. Using the terrain data, the LiDAR, or any other data that might be available, but without deploying a field survey crew to collect cross sections up and down the channel, or the stream, the river. It's relying on other data sources. So that's one big difference. And as Jed mentioned, LiDAR does not penetrate water surfaces. So as shown on the upper right, sometimes there could be a significant difference between what the LiDAR is picking up as the bottom of the channel compared to what a field survey would pick up. Now that would be dependent on flow conditions at the time that the LiDAR flight occurred. Step 2 is the hydrology. So here we're looking at how much flow is measured at a given point over a given amount of time. And for all the Zone A analyses in Curry County, we use the regional regression equations published in the USGS report from 2005. And then step 3 is the hydraulics. And this is where we're using computer modeling to look at backwater conditions to compute water surface elevations. So with an approximate model, we do not have bridges and culverts field surveyed, so we make assumptions on those types of structures because they can impact water surface elevations upstream and downstream. And we also approximate some other variables that go into the model. So before I jump into the timeline and final steps and what we have laid out today, I want to briefly go over how to read a flood insurance rate map. So here's one map as depicted on the screen there, where in the solid blue colors we're identifying the 1% floodplain. 1% is also commonly referred to as a 100-year floodplain. So that would reflect A zones, the approximate riverine, VE, the for coastal, V for, also for coastal, and then AE zones for detailed riverine. Then riverine studies, if it's detailed, typically have a floodway that was modeled as part of the past effort. So those are depicted in the hatching as pointed or as shown on the screen with the leader there. And then additionally on the flood insurance rate maps, we identify cross sections and transect locations. So transects for the coastal, cross sections for the riverine, especially the detailed riverine. So you have that information in conjunction with collecting data from the flood insurance study report. And then we have base flood elevations published directly on the flood insurance rate map. Those are in the squiggly lines. And also water surface elevations are identified at the cross sections for the riverine studies. And then lastly, in the orange shade, we have the 0.2%, also often referred to as the 500-year floodplain. So I want to touch on the next steps with this study as we wrap it up over the next year or so. So we'll be entering the due process followed by the adoption process. First, I want to highlight the key dates. So today we have 2 public open houses, of course one now and then another one this evening in the city of Brookings. We're projecting to start a 90-day appeal period, so that's part of the due process. We project that to start in May of this year and conclude in the summertime. And then depending on any significant comments received or appeals, that could affect the timeline to the next milestone. Without any significant appeals, we're projecting issuing a letter of final determination in the winter of late this year or early next year. And then 6 months after that is the effective date of the flood insurance study. And that's projected for the summer of 2018. So I briefly mentioned the appeal period, the 90-day appeal period starting in May. And I want to cover that a little bit more detail. It's pretty important to point out that all appeals must be supported by scientific data demonstrating that the results produced with the appeal package are more accurate or more correct than what FEMA and the project team have put forth. It has to be stamped by a registered professional engineer, or if it's based on terrain data, a professional land surveyor. And those appeal documents should be submitted to your local community and then routed by them to FEMA. So to categorize a comment or additional data as an appeal, it's a fairly high bar given that it requires the registered professional engineer or professional land surveyor. But one reason we have that requirement in there is because of the work we produce. And if we were to go another route with a letter of map revision or a future study, it would have the same requirements, that it's overseen by an engineer or scientist or surveyor for terrain delineation. So anything not meeting that appeal threshold would be categorized as a comment. And comments could reflect objections to the flood insurance, or excuse me, to this flood hazard areas. It could also reflect comments on labels or typos, those sorts of things. And we will review all comments and respond and work with the county and the cities to resolve those comments, similar to the approach we would with an appeal. So one example of an appeal that we're anticipating coming from the city of Brookings and Curry County, the map there on the left is the preliminary panel we issued back in August. Unfortunately, there were some, we overlooked some of the mapping elements on that panel. This is where the Teco River ties into the ocean there. So we've already addressed this and issued informally approved panel, which I have on the table in the back, to the city and the county to address this discrepancy. So as you can see on the left, this area here includes much greater flood extent than on the right. So we'll see that reduction, and we'll work with the county and the cities to formalize that part of the process during the appeal period. So as I mentioned, all appeals and comments should be provided to your county or city, and we actually have forms today that you should have or could pick up from the sign-in table. If you want to write down your comments and concerns today, you can leave those with the county and the cities. Otherwise, you can mail them in or email them to the appropriate jurisdiction. And if you have any comments not requiring or not prompting a desire for a response coming from or going to the county or the cities, those can be emailed to our contract team. So that might be typos and those sorts of things. So we have two other procedures or processes that one could follow, given the short window of the appeal and comment period. The first is a letter of map amendment, where, say, as a property owner, perhaps you had a site survey done not too long ago. Well, typically that field survey is going to be more accurate or at a more detailed level than what the LiDAR picks up. So you could look at that to get a better delineation of the flood extents on a given property. So the letter of map amendment process is one route to go. We can support that effort by providing the base flood elevation, which would also be a requirement of that application. If there are changes to reflect new modeling or new data, then the letter of map revision process is the best route. And that does require, as I mentioned, the oversight of a professional or a registered professional engineer. But those are two options, and we would work with any communities that do provide comments. If we can't incorporate it into this update as part of the appeal period, we can look at these avenues. And they're typically much faster than this 7 to 8, 9 years time frame for a big study like a coastal and countywide. They typically could take 6 to 18 months. Oops. So some of our final steps for this update: after we conclude the appeal period, we'll be coordinating with the county, the cities on any appeals submitted, as well as all the technical comments to proceed to or identify a resolution. And after that time frame, we can then proceed to issue a letter of final determination, and that starts a 6-month process for the county and the cities to update their floodplain management or floodplain ordinances and formally adopt the flood insurance study and flood insurance rate maps. It also allows them to continue the outreach to folks about the changes. So I want to briefly describe excuse me, what we have laid out today. Where you can obtain more specific information about a given property. So in this room, we have 3 stations set up. On the left, or actually, I'm going to go in order with my slides. Out in the hallway, some of you may have already stopped at the property identification and mapping table. I don't have it on this slide, but on one of the handouts that describes each of the stations, we also have a website where if you don't want to wait in line, shouldn't be a line, or if you don't need a printout of a map, you can look if you have a smartphone or an internet connection, you can see the changes online. But if you would like a map, or if you don't have that accessibility, you can go to the property identification table, provide an address, and they can print out a map showing the changes, the effective and the proposed with the preliminary. You can also add additional layers like the imagery, And I think there might be parcel data, parcel boundaries that they can show as well. And then here in this room, in the far back, we have the flood insurance table and our flood insurance specialist, where you can take your questions regarding insurance ratings for a given property, what goes into the rating calculations, and how you might look at improving your insurance rating. And then next to her, we have the floodplain regulations table, where if you have questions about the development standards and building requirements. Right, and then in the middle of this room, we have the community tables for the county and the cities. We have two cities of Brookings, Gold Beach, and Port Orford, along with Curry County. Or if you have questions about the planning or permitting process, you can take those questions there. And then to my right, we have the State Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, where we have questions for information on mapping priorities, also the state's perspective on the National Flood Insurance Program, and some literature on the National Marine Fisheries Service's biological opinion in regards to the National Flood Insurance Program. And then, where I was going to start initially, to the left, we have Jed and Star, to FEMA's contractor, to answer questions about what went into this study, the data, the analysis. We also have the open file report from Degami for the coastal analysis. We have a list of the summary of map action, so if you happen to have a letter of map amendment already, and you're interested to understand how these changes affect the status, or potentially affect the status of that summary, of that map change, such as a letter of map amendment, or a letter of map revision based on fill, we have that information at that table. You can also acquire information on the appeal process, or submitting technical comments. So I think we want to take a few minutes and see if there are any general questions, and then we could, you can take your specific property or property-specific questions to the various tables. Are there any general questions? One sec.
Yes. I live in the northern part of Curry County, out on the ocean, New River area. Kind of representing 5 of us, big ranches through there, where we're flooded out yearly, big time anymore. And on agriculture land, what table would I want to go to?
Probably want to start with the state table. Chris, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I'll start with the LCD.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Any other general questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Oh, also up front and out in the hallway, we have some literature, Help for Self. Number of them have a number of copies for you to take, and they pertain to multiple hazards and FEMA's programs. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.